Exercise contraindications. Consider that in Western society, about 80% or a little bit greater than that of the population will actually experience some sort of back pathology. It could be a minor, it could be major, but most of the people in Western society are going to be dealing with some sort of back issue. We know from very old research from the 60s that intervertebral disc pressure is highest in L4 and L5 in the seated position. So most folks are spending a tremendous amount of time, especially the folks that we're working with. They're literally at their desk. They're coming into our fitness facilities and they're working out and then they're going right back to their desk. Maybe they have sit-stand stations. We see more facilities obviously offering those up. But our culture really spends a lot of time seated. And so it's something that we have to really consider, that when we're putting them in the fitness facility, does it make sense to sit them back down when they're sitting all day long? For some folks early on, it might make logical sense if they're very, very brand new to resistance training that they're going to maybe do some seated exercises because a machine is a heck of a lot safer. Its base of support is large. It's very stable. The range of motion is pre-prescribed, so it makes it a lot easier. But for folks who are sitting down all day and once they develop some sort of capacity and general preparedness, we probably don't want to be sitting them down for the long haul of their training session, because they're getting more than enough of that between their work, their day work, their commutes, and all the other areas where they may be sitting. Something else to consider is that we do know that repetitive spinal flexion with moderate compressive load or compression, has been shown to actually cause or recreate the disc herniation mechanism. So this is research from Dr. Stuart McGill, and I'll talk about him in the next slide. So if we're sitting down and we are in a forward flex position at our desk, we commute to work, we're in our car, we're losing, we're not maintaining the lumbar spine because we're a little bit forward, we're reinforcing flexion, spinal flexion. Then we come into the gym, maybe we're sitting down, maybe we're banging away on crunches and sit-ups for our ab training. We're reinforcing that kyphotic nature of the spine from all of the other stimulus. You have to remember that your clients, your participants at the fitness facility are they're getting healthy dosages of spinal flexion. You may not need to recreate that in the gym, especially considering if they have a history of back issues. Okay, so our exercise contraindications, first and foremost, pain. If someone presents pain during an exercise program, during a smart path assessment, during an FMS movement screen, we stop what we're doing and we refer out to allied healthcare. Pain is a red flag. Pain changes the way the body moves subconsciously, because the body will do things to avoid that pain and will create all sorts of compensatory movement patterns to minimize irritating that or creating potential injury. So, this is a hard one. I get that this is hard, but your job is to do no harm as an exercise professional. Your job is to prescribe exercise for relatively healthy individuals with no pre-existing conditions without medical clearance. And if someone presents pain and you say, well, I can work around that, that's actually not true. It's actually nearly impossible, because you can't work around pain. Pain is always there. And depending on the severity of it, that's a different conversation, because some people can actually, mitigate or minimize the impact of pain. At least they think subconsciously. But the reality is, consciously, subconsciously, that pain is still impacting their movement quality. So pain is your red flag. That is the first and foremost thing. You learn that in FMS. That is the way it stands at the site level. If someone presents pain, we're not training them through that pain. We need to get that evaluated by an allied healthcare, so general practitioner. If your facility has a resource on site, please refer them out to, a physical therapist, their primary healthcare physician, their PCP, someone that has the diagnostic skill sets to evaluate that. Couple other contraindications. There's really not a wrong way to exercise. There's just what these contraindications, right? So loaded spinal flexion. When your spine is flexed, and you see here in the picture, the nucleus pulposa, or the jelly-like center nucleus of the disc, starts to drift to the opposing direction of where that compression is happening. Over time, that can squeeze the contents, and basically the annulus, the rings around the disc that make up the cartilaginous nature of the disc, they start to fracture or crack, and the nucleus actually starts to seep through until you finally get out towards the very end, or the last ring, and maybe you get a bulge, and or maybe it herniates. You just don't know. So we want to make sure that people are lifting with neutral spine, maintaining a lordotic curve in their lumbar spine, maintaining a relative kyphotic curve in their C-spine, and a lordotic curve in their neck. You shouldn't be extending your neck backwards or flexing your spine forward. It should just maintain neutral spine, and neutral is individual. Everyone has a little bit of different geometry when it comes to their genetics and how curvy their spine is. But you want to maintain neutral for that individual. So we don't lift, we don't pick things up, we don't deadlift with a flexed spine. Loaded flexion with rotation is equally as bad. So that would be flexion with rotation. So squeezing the disc and then rotating it and squeezing it even further to the left or right side. That's usually folks who claim or have a back issue will say, yeah, I was bending over and picking up my keys. I bent over and reached across, picked up my keys, and I felt a sharp pain. It's a very common mechanism for disc pathology. So we have to be very conscientious about Russian twists. When folks are sitting in the Russian twist position, they typically are in a little bit of kyphosis. If you stand if you stand laterally and kind of view them, you'll see that as they rotate around, their spine has actually lost its neutral position, and they're actually in kyphosis, which means that the disc material is moved, and now they're potentially grinding and potentially causing some trauma. Those decline sit-ups and with rotation and the med ball and all these things, and we see all this kind of stuff. Like, our job is to do no harm. And if we know this stuff causes injury, and it may not be today, and it may not be tomorrow, and it may not be a week from now, but we want to minimize risk of injury and provide safe, effective exercise strategies. And so this is where we may want to look at stabilization training. So maybe more planks, more isometric contractions, bird dogs, side planks, Pallof press, stir the pot. These are all great exercises that still train the core, but don't put the same type of forces that compress the disc like those other patterns, sit-ups and crunches and things like that. So the spine training really needs to be individualized, and I'm jumping ahead here, and that's because it depends on someone's genetics. So someone with a more flexible spine can rotate easier. Someone with a more rigid spine, like a linebacker, can't. But they can take a lot of compressive force, and you can't train for both. You're a little bit predetermined by your parents, the shape of your discs, and kind of the patterns that you've chosen, exercise patterns that you've chosen over life. They reinforce the disc, or they allow the disc to be a little bit more flexible. But it all depends on your genetics. So you really want to train towards the type of spine that the individual has, which is not always easy to know because most people don't get MRIs of their spine and tell you, hey, I have ovaloid or limacon shaped discs. Finally, we do know McGill's research, Dr. Stuart McGill, and that website there, www.backfitpro.com. If you're not familiar with Dr. McGill, he's a spine biomechanist who's done a tremendous amount of research on spine and really looking at, hey, what exercises in the fitness industry does we say were great? And there's not a lot of evidence on that. So we started looking at a lot of these things. And he did document that repetitive flexion and extension under a relative modest load causes the disc herniation mechanism. So we have to be very careful with how we're recommending our core exercises, especially if someone is constantly in a seated position, constantly in a flexed position, we do not need to be putting them in a flexed position chronically or reinforcing that when they come to us to work with us and do some core stuff. So let's look at doing some stabilization training, some bird dogs, some side plank, and even some glute bridges to help strengthen the glutes, which will help long term, to minimize potential back issues.